The Singapore Cyber Security Consortium, their goal is to drive a translation of research academia. So obviously, this is something that a topic that's meeting real-world challenges in both the industry and also the government, the regulators. There's no need for me to take up more time to talk about what cybersecurity is all about. It is certainly a topic that the public is very interested in among the many stakeholders in this area, and we are very privileged today that we have invited a very distinguished academic to share with us her research on this topic, and I'm eagerly waiting to hear her talk for sure. Our speaker today is Professor Elisabeth Paté-Cornell from Stanford University, and her specialty has been in engineering risk analysis with applications to complex systems such as health and space. Professor Paté-Cornell is the Burke and Didi McMurtry Professor in Stanford's School of Engineering. She's also Professor and Founding Chair of the Department of Management, Science and Engineering. Her earlier research has focused on the optimization of warning systems and the explicit inclusion of human and organizational factors in the analysis of system failure risk. More recently, she has incorporated game theory to risk analysis, and applications have included counter-terrorism, nuclear counter-proliferation programs, and the topic today is cybersecurity. She's the author of more than 100 publications and co-editor of a book on perspective on complex global problems. Not to take up too much of our time, this is just a small part, a tip of an iceberg of her very distinguished career. But let us put our hands together to welcome Professor Paté-Cornell to give us a talk.
So, good afternoon. My name is Elisabeth Paté-Cornell, and what I'm going to present is not only my work, but that of my doctoral students who are under 5 vignettes. Following the brilliant introduction that you have heard, we're going to get into the details of these 5 vignettes. Perhaps you can show me. It works. Very well. Does it go forward? Okay, so let me give you a few basic introductions to our risk analysis work. We use probability, we quantify things with everything that we have, all the information we have. Statistics, when they apply, expert opinions otherwise. We never predict anything. We provide information under the form generally of probabilities and the chances of something. We want to make sure that we keep the risk separated from the values and preferences. And our objective is to set priorities because we are not infinitely rich and the days have only 24 hours. So just an idea of my past experience, I have covered a lot of ground from seismic risk to a lot of space systems. I'm on the board of NASA and national security, insurance companies, and a few other things. So this is where I come from when I look at the cyber risk analysis that I'm going to present. And that's where it took me when I was on the investigation of the BP accident. So all that to say, you go see how things work before you talk about that. In my Stanford course, I teach all kinds of basic concepts in risk analysis and the analysis of the underlying system, but also the psychology and the economics of risk, which you're going to say, and as our previous speaker pointed out, is a very important part of the risk. And you're going to see that a lot of the things I'm talking about end up in what we call games, in the sense of game theory, and of course cybersecurity is one of them. So why do we do a cyber risk analysis? Well, an alternative to the hand-wringing that we see a lot of. The stuff happens philosophy, and that's like the expurgated version, and blind or myopic spending. So there's no way we're going to get to zero risk. The question is, what can we do to be effective? So why do we care about cyber attacks? And why do, because there has been attacks on industry that you're well aware of. The last one, for example, a year ago with WannaCry, which was essentially malware to extract money from hospitals in particular, interference in elections, attacks on infrastructures, Stuxnet, which you know started a virus that started a new era of warfare. And our main focus is here on enterprise networks and industrial control systems. Okay, so I'm going to present 5 vignettes that represent the 5 doctoral studies that I have either signed or in the process of working on. The statistical analysis in a company that I'm going to call Space Corp, and it's an aggregation of data that I got both from NASA and other corporations. Then I'm going to focus on the analysis of a network and show you that indeed there's an optimal level of connectivity, and you don't want to connect everything without knowing what is the trade-off between the benefits of the connection and the risks, the risk costs of the vulnerabilities that you create. And there we had excellent data from the Sacramento Municipal Utility District because we were focusing on a smart grid. Then I'm going to talk about something that our previous speaker mentioned, which is how to make life more difficult for the attackers. In particular, the optimal timing of software replacement inside your system so that you have people who have been studying your system for 3-4 months and you change, if you have the way of doing it, you change the way that system works. Then current research, which is still in being worked on, warning of attacks that is done by one of my students, an officer who comes from Cyber Command, and what he has done is to put a lot of honeypots around the world, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. And then finally, fake news, and also an Army officer, and the idea, the cyber aspects of fake news, and we're going to see, he focused on elections and financial markets, but also national security. The funding for that research comes from the DoD and from NASA. Okay, so again, why quantify the cyber risk to set priorities? And I'm going to say that what mathematical approaches have we used? And I promise no equations in this talk. Statistical analysis of data when you have them, and again, when they are relevant, since things change all the time. A probabilistic analysis that's based on scenarios. Some things have not happened yet, but we can see what it would take for it to happen, and that's the way we study the risks, again, of things that have not happened yet, and in the space business, for instance, I've had a lot of experience with that. The difficulty is to combine both. There is to use the statistics that we have to analyze scenarios we have not seen. Okay, so we have constructed a general risk model that I'm not going to present here because it would take a lot of time. But first, it's for a specific organization. Tell me who you are. And let's look at where you have the crown jewels and what is the structure of the system around the crown jewels. What are the potential adversaries? And it's not the same for Visa cards and for a hospital in general, although sometimes they do both. And then what are the consequences of successful attacks, of course, which is the consequences of risk analysis. So what we have, what we use here is a Bayesian network. And it's not very complicated, but it has a lot of different information. And we present it under the form of an inference diagram. So the attackers, we have heard about them earlier. So script kiddies, the nation states, insiders. And insiders in our story is become extremely important. There are several ways of trying to do something about it. First off, you don't give access to too much information to the same person, and you compartmentalize to the best you can. And sometimes you can also profile some insiders that seem to have more money than they should. Credit card skimmers, we have heard about that. Nefarious groups and shadow brokers and gray hat hackers who play on both sides, and you can buy their services to do both. So I see two distinct kinds of cyber attacks in the world in which I work. Those that are operational, And I think that they are still very costly, and we're going to stand there. And then the catastrophic, that can really take you down. Think about space. There are those where a space center might be disrupted in its day-to-day operations, but there's also those that could take a space mission down. We have not had that yet, but we can analyze that by looking at the scenarios. Okay, so let's first focus on the daily operations of a particular center that we looked at, and looking at the two entries that we still find very, can I say, vulnerable, email and websites. And I've listed the others here. And the costs of successful attacks, we have been focusing in particular on the loss of intellectual and physical property. Think of, for example, a big corporation like Lockheed Martin or things like that, and the business interruption when you have to fix something that has been destroyed by the attackers. Countermeasures, I've listed them, but here there are two things that we have found particularly useful: the full disk encryption and two-factor authentication. Now, I do agree that having a 16-character password that you have to change all the time, something that has been inflicted on me more than once, it's certainly not very effective. So the effectiveness of these measures, I'm going to show you a couple of examples, but it depends, of course, on the nature of attack, the type, and the ease of implementation. Okay. Now, first vignette. So that's the work of one of my students called Marshall Kuipers, who has been immediately hired by a company, a startup. What we have here is 60,000 data points. It's not a huge database, but it was enough to look over 6 years at the evolution of the problem. So data exists in many companies and many organizations, but they are not very willing generally to share them. Now, apparently, there are some organizations that have been more successful at sharing them, but in this case, they have been sitting on them. Here is what we found that I thought was very interesting. You look at the time axis, and you look at the cumulative number of lost devices, because at that point, we were focusing on lost and stolen devices. And you see that in this case, after the full disk encryption was implemented, the losses it was stable. So that's all we can say. So it was remarkably consistent over time after that. Now, here is theoretically the most difficult part. This is what we call a risk curve. On the horizontal axis, you have the costs of an attack. On the vertical axis, you have the probability of exceeding each of these levels of costs. And we have here in this curve 3 regions. The first one is the one that's driven by the statistics. Statistics, when they are good, it's happiness in risk analysis, but generally we don't have that. At the other end, we have a scenario model where we have to ask ourselves, what would it take for these kinds of events to occur? And it would take a conjunction of dependent events in general, for which we have partial information in terms of statistics, and for which we need expert opinion. What kind of scenarios, again, would lead to the loss of a spacecraft? The difficulty mathematically is in this overlap zone where we have to use both and to make sure that we understand the connection. Okay, here is some result of that analysis. And again, this is a risk curve. That means the probability of exceeding various annual costs depending on the nature of the kinds of attack that you have. In blue, for instance, entrance through email. And again, phishing is still a very good way of entering a system. And if we focus on spillage, for example, so people who reveal data that they should not, you see that spillage is relatively low risk, but the losses from the website compromises are usually small, except every so often they can be huge. And the difficulty is to look at this upper limit, the nature of the target, and the scenarios and the expert opinions that we need to use, for instance, if we are talking about protecting a very important system that you're constructing and you prefer not to see falling in the hands of the bad guys. Okay, so here we looked at an attempt by that organization to reduce phishing by training the people who are in front of their computers. And we saw that what was the relative rates of success and how does it decrease the risk. And you see in blue, we have the current risk. In red, we have a system that reduces it. I mean, current risk is about 20% of people fall for it. After the red kind of training, you reduce it by 5%, and the green, you reduce it by 10%. That is, you reduce the rate at which people respond. And these are the kinds of new risk curves that represent the benefits that you see in the reduction of the probability of exceeding different levels of losses. Takeaways from Marshall's thesis is that we can do the risk quantification. In fact, this model has been, we passed it along to Swiss Reinsurance and had long conversations with them. The rate of attacks in that organization was relatively constant after implementation of some measures, and the countermeasures effectiveness can be compared, and in this case we did it through risk curves, and we found out that full disk encryption and two-factor authentication were by far the most effective. Number two, Major Smith, who was motivated by the Ukrainian attack to look at what was going to be the optimal level of connectivity in the cyber grid security, the smart grid. And again, it was motivated by the fact that in December 15, two power plants in the Ukraine were attacked. And they were attacked in particular because they were so well connected. And a lot of people were without power for a long time. And so we're going to show you how we did the analysis of this optimal level of connectivity. So challenges with the electric grid is that we have limited number of known scenarios. There is, of course, as usual, the trade-off between security and performance. And what he's trying to find out here, in fact, were two things. The optimal allocation of cyber defense teams and what is the optimal level of connectivity, and I'm going to show you how we did it. So if you have too much connectivity, the question is how smart is smart enough in your smart grid? Smart grid benefits, of course, you have an improvement in the efficiency and the reliability by allowing the connection between the physical system and the internet. But of course, every time that you introduce a new connection, you introduce a new vulnerability, and the same is true, in fact, for your house, when you can control a lot of things from your cell phone, but you're not the only one who can do that. Okay, so what was the network model and the decisions that had to be made? The system operator control the power grid and the network and risk. The operator may choose to connect or not to connect, and the question is, what do you concentrate the attention of your resources? And what are your resources? The people who monitor the vulnerabilities that you already know, and we call them the watchers, and people who look for new vulnerability, and we call them the hunters. Okay, here is a smart grid. At the bottom, you find the generation, the transmission, the distribution, and customers. And at the top, you look at the internet connections, and you have virtual private networks. And the question is, what is the optimal level of connection? And the best way to represent it, I think, is this one. So here at the bottom, again, you have the physical network. You have connections between the physical network and the cloud. And as you can see here, I have a question mark. Do we want to introduce one more connection between a particular subsystem and the internet? So again, too much connectivity. Congress got very concerned about it, and they wanted to unplug some parts of the grid, and that was in part because of this Ukraine incident. So now, smartness has its benefits, otherwise we wouldn't do it. And here I just named a few: to automate the inspections, to a quick detection of the problems. You see vegetation around the lines here. to improve the market efficiency by reacting more quickly to the demand. So there is a benefit to these connections, otherwise we wouldn't have them. Now, the flip, of course, is cyber risk, and I'm going to talk about phantom mouse and the countdown to 0 day, the Stuxnet. Some past events, Aurora, Idaho National Lab in 2007, there was a simulation of a cyber attack, except that it was publicly released by error with the follow-up that you can imagine. The phantom mouse is something that I'm also very concerned about. It's a software that's designed to take control of the mouse of someone else and to operate the system as if and preventing the company that owns it from making it work the way it should. That's what happened in the Ukraine. I understand that we have found some ways of going around these kinds of systems, but for the moment, the phantom mouse is still one thing I'm concerned about. Okay, so bottom line here, what's the best allocation of our resources beyond the minimum mandatory standards that have been given to us? Okay, so the dynamics of cybersecurity investment, question again is exploitation of what we already know, and with all the uncertainties that we have, all the studies that we do take into account probability and uncertainties, because there are lots of things that we need to discover, versus exploration, finding new vulnerabilities, and as you see at the bottom here is the US Department of Defense team of people doing just that. The model that my student constructed is based on a very classic operations research model, which is called the multi-arm bandit. Either you play a machine for which you know what are the chances of winning, or you try a new machine, you don't know what the chances are, but it might be, after all, a better deal. And the same thing is true in protecting the vulnerabilities that you already know, or looking for some for which you do not know what is the probability that some people will be able to get through it. Okay, so what is the algorithm that he developed? Systems analysis first, then an economic analysis of the financial benefits and risks, and then stochastic modeling using this multi-node model that I just showed you. There's the nodes that you know versus those that you suspect might be vulnerable, and then find the optimal level of smartness. So he was he had all kinds of, in fact, all kinds of data and data sources here. The economic models he found through utility companies. Now, the price and the customer demand he found in this Energy Information Administration publication. And the risks include, in fact, the cascading effect, because if you do in the US, if you attack the grid in Oregon, in Washington State, you affect Oregon, you affect California, and the question is to know, of course, what is the effect of the total risk of these cascading failures. Okay, so but we had the NESCOR data, and we were lucky to get specific data from the Sacramento Municipal Utility District. Okay, so that's the kind of curve that he found in the end. We're looking at benefits at the top, the risks at the bottom, on an axis of how smart, meaning how many connections you have. He found that there was indeed an optimum of smartness. So what are the takeaways from Matt's thesis? The smartness is beneficial up to a point. That optimization we can do because we have some statistics, we have expert opinions, but there is a lot of information there. That was the good news for that thesis. And we have to take into account, of course, the secondary effects of the losses that we can have, in this case, from state to state. Now, extension to the public networks, the same thing can happen to you. So the private connections can be used to enter your own house. Again, you can put in your fridge some kind of sensing device that tells you you're out of milk, but you are connecting your house once again to a network. So clearly there's an optimal level of connectivity in the public. what are these organizations doing with that information? Marketing being one possibility, surveillance, for instance, and then what are the benefits of these smart systems? So there's a need for public education here about this trade-off between the risks and the benefits of all the connections that the previous speaker was talking about. I mean, people adding connections and have the feeling sometimes without thinking too much about the effect of doing that. Okay, and number 3, that I've signed again last year, upgrading the control software to stay ahead of an adversary. And that's something that was pointed out by our previous speaker, which is that an attack is not done instantaneously. It takes months. So if you know roughly how long it takes, and I'm going to show you that we found some good data from Symantec, what you can try to do is to make it more difficult by changing regularly the software or patching the software inside your system. That's what some companies have failed to do, including the hospitals that were victims of that attack last year. The attack, ransomware attack of May 2017. And the Ukraine attack, again, had taken 6 months. People had been working for 6 months on these plants, and changing the software regularly can be done. But we're going to see that it's a matter of dynamic analysis, and we need to know a few things. Some of the factors involved are the discovery of new software vulnerabilities, but you need to have also the tools to actually change or patch your inside software. So we looked, why did we start this? Because there was a company, a water company, that had not changed its software for 10 years, and of course, and the man who had designed it had unfortunately disappeared. So it was extremely difficult to fix something that you did not know. And so they got attacked and didn't know what to do. And the same thing, by the way, was true of the hospitals that were attacked last year. I think their software also had not been changed for 10 years. Okay, so again, you cannot change it unless you have the software is available. So what we did is a stochastic model of the attack and defense timing based on all the information that we could get. And what we did in mathematical terms is to look over time at the dynamic analysis of these attacks, and we use the Markov model to represent these changes in the system state. That is, how close are we to the next attack. And this is the way Phil modeled the state transitions, publicly known vulnerabilities. And again, we have quite a lot of history here, and with a daily probability of new vulnerability discovery being 4%. And these are data that we got from Symantec that give us historical forensics. So a new vulnerability discovered, undiscovered for up to 30 months. The question is, how long does it take once your system has been attacked, by a new vulnerability has been created, and until you figured it out? So Symantec gave us these data, which I found very helpful. Okay, so the decision reconfiguration and patch depends, of course, on the probability of successful attack and the vulnerabilities, the costs of not doing the right thing. So we use decision analysis to combine all that. Okay, so there were many moving parts in that model. The model of the adversary attacker, it's a game, of course. The decision of the malware developer, and how long it takes them to do that. The stochastic models of discovery of these vulnerabilities. And finally, the conflict model, which is a game analysis. So we found the costs, and the results were an optimal software age for replacement, understanding again that it's not the easiest thing and the less costly thing to do. It's the same thing as changing the oil in your car. So what were the takeaways from Phil's thesis? You need to change or upgrade your software regularly. And the optimum is determined by several things, including the speed of the attacker's progress, the emergence of new vulnerabilities, and the existence of the patch or the new software that you need, and of course the cost of doing that. So these Markov models that we used were supporting the decision to upgrade or change that software, given these realities for which we do not have perfect information. Number 4, so this is current research, so we don't have the final story. Major Faber is looking at early warnings, and early warnings of attack based on people working at watching you, people who have entered your system, the warnings and signals that they have entered your system, and they are trying to circulate inside it, exfiltration signals, and if you have missed the boat, the signal that your information is out and is being used. And I remember talking to the lady who was in charge of that kind of stuff for a big credit card company, and she told me it took them 2 weeks at some point to figure out that this information was out. Okay, so what he is doing is he has built a global honeypot. I'm going to show you 17 of those around the world. Now, let me go back. So he has put 17 honeypots around the world to see who was voting on them. Of course, understanding that if you're a specific company, it's going to be a certain number of these people who are going to be interested in you specifically. So he has looked at sensors, he's looking at communication systems, and he's using the classic industry sequence of in an attack, and which is again reconnaissance, weaponization, delivery, exploitation, installation, command and control, and actions on objectives. There is the sequence of things that the bad guys are doing before they can get your what I call your crown jewels. So this is what's called a cyber kill chain, and this is the one of Lockheed Martin. And the question is signal identification. Attacks are not single occurrence, and they range from a few simple steps to repeated elaborate events. So we learn as we go. And the question we use Bayesian updating to look at this learning. And of course, we have to know what are the objectives of the attackers. And in these games, we always have 3 types of uncertainties. What do they know, what do they want, and what do they have? Okay, so he's computing the probability distribution of the time to an attack, given the kinds of signals that he has gotten, for example, about repeated attempts that he has seen. And of course, the severity of the attack, given the level of success, which is not always the same, looking at countermeasures and their effectiveness. So, for example, here is an example of the timing of malware attack, which happened last year. And as you can see, it's about 4 weeks until they have probing for vulnerable systems. Then it takes 1 week then to prepare the malware for a specific system. And then things happen after that within minutes. Delivering and the explicit, exploit, control, and execute the attack. Okay, so here are the kind of honeypots that he has put around the world. With total observation so far, we got about 400, no, much more than that. That was 400,000 when I wrote this. It's in the order of 600,000 attacks. And again, we know full well that sometimes the attacks are more targeted than what we quote here. Okay, so what are the preliminary takeaways that Isaac is finding? That he has found some precursors to cyber attacks, and is using machine learning techniques, involving the classic Bayesian updating, but also a lot more to try to figure out what are the new scenarios and what are the chances that they occur given the signals that we observe. So now for the last one. Colonel Trammell is looking in his ongoing research at fake news, but the cyber aspects of fake news. And he's trying to ask himself how the US government budget can be best used to counter this, focusing on financial problems, but also political and military attacks, which are very important to him. And so his objectives is to anticipate and recognize various degrees of fake news, of fakeness, because some of them are more clear, let's say, than others. And of course, the timing there is critical. So 2 examples. There was a fake evacuation alert of the US military in Korea in 2017. A correction message was sent, but after many hours, and it's not entirely clear to me why it took them that much time. He caught another one, which was a Russian false claim on NATO and the fact that NATO was going to attack on the Baltic borders. Of course, was fake news and was easily dismissed. Okay, now here's the problem that he has, is that the fake news are in an evolving environment, and in particular, fake videos are a new thing that we are concerned about and that we see emerging more and more. And particularly because of the connectivity of the systems that we have seen and the technology that will make it easier and easier. So here he was looking at the probabilistic over time. What is the optimal timing if you're trying to interfere with elections? And this is from the perspective of the bad guys. And of course, the one that we should use as soon as we get technical signals that something's happening. One success story, for instance, were the French presidential elections a couple of years ago, when they anticipated the Russians to interfere, and they had immediately sent messages to the public at large saying, here is what they are trying to achieve, here is what they are going to try to make you believe, and so don't fall for it, and that's when they did not fall for it. The countermeasures before and after attacks, 2 kinds, education and flagging. Flagging means you're saying, hey, this is absolutely fake news, it's obvious. Education is to spot fake news, to know to what degree you can believe something. There was a time when the New York Times, for example, 2 years ago, was giving every day a report on the degrees of fakeness of some of the news that you could find on the social media, for instance. Okay, so the preliminary takeaway that I see from Travis's thesis, spectrum of fake news, the detection and correction, not obvious, but it's step 1. The timing and the credibility of the response are essential. And that's the difficulty. When you have fake news, try to explain why that doesn't work, why it is fake news. And the credibility of that response to the fake news is more and more difficult to establish, of course. And the allocation of the resources will depend on the timing of the events that you're trying to prevent. So my general conclusion is that the perception of cyber risk is often apocalyptic, and the question is, okay, good, but what do we do next? And that's what we're trying to do. There's a lot of qualitative research. We are trying to put quantitative analysis on top of that. Again, using everything that we have, knowing how imperfect it is, and that's why we end up with probability. And what we want to do is to access the existing data, but also create new ones, create new databases, and create new information. And because we are academics, we can share it with anyone we want. And we can publish it any way we want, provided, of course, that people who have access to our clearances do not put their foot down. And that will be my conclusion. So a few years ago, cyber risk analysis was considered impossible, and now the question is, how do we do it better? And that's what we are trying to do. And again, we do what we can with what we have. That's the end.
Very, very pleased to take a few questions. So the floor is open. Melvin, yeah.
Hello, thanks for the wonderful talk, Elisabeth. Yeah, I like probability a lot. I also work in that area. I'm also in the same area of prediction research. But let's try, I'm trying to be a devil advocate right now. So if you look at probability, the inherent difficulties on risk of this nature, these are low probability, high impact, heavy tail distribution, which is very difficult to estimate. All right. and we don't have enough data, right? So if I look at the data over there, if you look at the probability of event, the value of risk of say a period of 1 year, probability of that occurring in 10 to the power minus 4, you take thousands of years to estimate that kind of reliability, right? If you want that kind of reliability. But the fact that we only have a short history, and somehow you have to impute, and to some extent, even the best estimate of probability is going to be uncertain. This can be troubling. Like for example, if you look at the financial crisis, the derivative models, the financial models are kind of based on the assumption of normality. It is not true because the standard deviation of that happening is about 10 standard deviation away, which is about 1 in a few billion years. Right. So what happens if you underestimate probability? So in other words, you might think that it is low tail. Like in simulation, we will assume independence and so forth to make it easier, right? But it could underestimate. So it could be a possibility the model sounds technically, but we might underestimate the risk, something that a recurrence of the what we see in 2008 financial crisis. Is there ways that the model should take into account of the potential inestimates errors, right? And what can be done to that?
Thank you. Actually, that's exactly what we're trying to do. So we do not have statistical data for a lot of things, particularly what you were talking about, which is the financial crisis, which have not happened exactly yet, and all the data have changed. So if we look at financial models involving the correlation between the various entities and the general market, these correlations vary all the time. So what we do when we do not have probability for one particular event is to try to decompose the scenarios into small parts where we understand better what's going on. Okay, so we do not have statistics for a particular scenario of a catastrophic event, but what we could do is to look at what are the different events that it would take to get there, and try to get the best information that we can for each of the parts of these scenarios. And that's the best that we can do. And by the way, we can both overestimate or underestimate the probability. And that's why one of the things that I always say is don't take the most likely hypothesis and present it to the boss as if you were sure of it, because you're not. So the difficulty is to represent your uncertainties to the people who are going to use that information to make decisions. And for financial crisis, I was looking at some point with a student of mine. I'm not a specialist of finance, he was, and we were looking at the effect of spreads. Yeah? So as a signal, you look at the spreads of interest rates between LIBOR and, let's say, the actual rate. That is reflecting what has happened in the years before. Now, something entirely new could happen that we do not know about. No, again, we do what we can with what we have. And what is most important in a case like this is to present it to the decision maker, complete with all the uncertainties, and not to pretend that we are predicting anything. Because I'm not predicting things. The alternative is a wet finger in the wind, and that's what we're trying to avoid. Yes, sir.
Sorry, Raymond Kwok. I'm an actuary by training. I mean, I was in insurance. I'm still in insurance.
Yes.
I'm very interested in cybersecurity insurance because the cybersecurity attack, when it hits, is pervasive. We don't have a multiple car collision except in highway.
Yeah.
So the question will be that with your analysis, I'm sure that the insurance company as well as the reinsurance will be very interested. Are you able to share with us some of the things that you're doing? Because I'm actually on the ground. I'm involved in cybersecurity insurance and also a lot of verticals. Thanks.
Okay, so here I'm going to the general model that we are using. This is called an inference diagram. So in green, the question is, who is the defender and who are you? My first question to you, if I'm an insurer and you're trying to buy an insurance from me, is, who are you? And what's the structure of your system? And you pointed out earlier that understanding the structure of your system is essential. What are the objectives of the guys who are trying to attack you? Who are they, by the way? And what is the probability or the possibility that insiders in your company are doing something nasty to you? Then the question is, what is the vulnerability of your target? If I look at the structure of your system, which I will do carefully. And then I look at the attack scenario. So we are back to the penetration, the navigation, the extraction, and the use of the information, given the structure of your system. And again, the time that it takes to enter it, which is not, as we have seen and said several times, instantaneous. Then I look at the countermeasures that you can take, and there are many different kinds of countermeasures, from the physical ones and the technical ones to the much more human ones. Then again, we make decisions about these countermeasures, and we look at the consequences to the defender. The defender, the one who is being attacked. Now, it's extremely specific to your company. So if you are a hospital, it will be different from if you are Visa or if you are Boeing. And so that's where we will start, which is to know, again, what's the structure of the system, how compartmentalized is it, and who has access to what, and what are the possible points of intrusion, the vulnerability. So it's a very specific and systematic systems analysis, the structure of it, to try to, again, do the best we can with what we have. But that's the kinds of things that we have discussed extensively with Swiss reinsurance, to try to be specific about companies and find a way to set premiums that are reasonable, but at the same time effective, economically effective. So this is a very general representation of a Bayesian model, and that's the best we can do. Yes, sir.
Perhaps a comment first. It seems from your talk, and thank you very much for your talk, and Michael's, that the game is less cybersecurity, but it's moving more towards cyber intelligence. So understand the battlefield where it's going to play out. Gather intelligence from the perspective of who can attack you and how they can do that. And I wonder if this is a good case for intelligence-based security testing, red teaming, these kind of things. I also wonder if there was any information you had around the pace of application development. So we've had to move from nice, careful waterfall development into agile, into now where it's multiple releases in one day. How can a security team possibly keep up with that pace of app release? And I wonder if that has to start actually requiring risk calculations on which releases I'm going to think about security on, because I just don't have capacity to try and security test or scan code for vulnerabilities. It's taken it up a level in the app development space.
Okay, so you have two questions. Let me start with the red teams. The red teams issues that we have looked at are, again, the people who are exploiting the vulnerabilities that you know, the watchers, and the people who are, in fact, trying to find new vulnerabilities, what we call the hunters. And so, yes, we have looked very carefully at the effectiveness of these red teams. I was talking a couple of days ago to an executive in a utility company, and he was telling me that, in fact, he puts most of his resources on the watchers rather than the hunters. But it is because of the specific characteristics of his utility company. And your second question, can you repeat it again?
Really, yeah, it's really about the phrase DevSecOps or SecDevOps, where really the development, application development teams need to really be working side by side with the security teams, rather than in different departments, where security is telling app development, you must develop securely, your development lifecycle must look like this, and the development guys are saying it can't possibly look like that. We've moved so far from where we used to be. This is happening almost minute by minute, so let's work together and think about which releases may be more risk prone, so I can at least do something on some releases, but certainly not on all. And I just think that landscape's changing very quickly.
You're absolutely right. Let's say that I've never done that explicitly quite in those terms. What I'm trying to do is to provide information to both sides, saying, gentlemen, ladies, you could be much more effective given that most of the risk is on this part of your system, and here is what you can do on that part. Working together would be great. But I will not pretend that I have done it in those terms. What I'm trying to do with my students for the moment is to provide tools to quantify for both sides, if you wish, what are the benefits of various countermeasures. But you're absolutely right. There is one countermeasure that has to do with collaboration that obviously I've not put in these models. I mean, not explicitly. So I will not pretend that otherwise.
Any other question? I'm just wondering, I have a very mundane question. This relates to a real experience in NUS. And some of our, if I'm not wrong, some of our cybersecurity breaches actually came from the humans themselves, the users. And the most basic and the most unsophisticated kind of phishing emails, they continue to attract people to. I'm just wondering about the people angle.
This email attacks was exactly one of the key the focus of the first presentation, the first case that I presented. We had all these statistics, and email and, in fact, websites were the two most often used effective points of entry. 20% of people responding to phishing and falling for phishing attempts. So that we have looked at based on that, based on this data set that we had. Now, how do you train people to not do that? And that's what the company that we were doing this with tried very hard to do. So to train everybody here, try to see who was falling for emails, phishing in examples that they were sending at random, by the way, to see, and they were training people not to fall for that. So it will remain for the moment, I think, one of the most vulnerable part of the system, emails and phishing and spear phishing. So all you can do is to try to train people, and if they don't want to, if they don't understand, and of course the spear phishing is becoming more and more sophisticated. You see more and more things that really look like they are coming from your boss. So again, that's an art in which the bad guys are. It's a race. It's a race of sophistication.
It's an arms race, I think.
Yeah,
it's an arms race.
And the whole cybersecurity field is an arms race.
Sorry, Raymond Kwok again. Just got one question, which I do not know whether relevant. We seems to keep on sitting on the defensive side. I do not know whether it's legal to counterattack the cybersecurity guy, cripple their system rather than try to cripple us. I've been thinking about this for a long time, but my principal says that it's illegal because then you become the cyber attacker. But I think we are attacking the one who are attacking us.
Well, it is illegal, but the laws are changing, let's say, and the laws are changing, and the practices are changing. One of the difficulties is to make sure that you counterattack the right person and the right side, and you're not always sure where the attack is coming from, and so you might send a counterattack to where it doesn't belong, and if you're clever enough when you attack, you pretend it comes from another place than yours. So there are difficulties in counterattacks, but I agree with you that we would like to make sure that the attacks are not for free to the attacker. And the question is how to do that in ways that do not lead to escalation and to a point where we get into a cyber war, which is not something that we would like to get into.
I'd actually like to present a slightly different take on the lack of public awareness and education. I actually think a lot of cyber security communities are too busy focusing on all those sophisticated strategies and frameworks and systems and processes. Not enough is being done in creating awareness of basic cyber hygiene for the layperson. That's an observation. And I have a question. Given that there will always be vulnerabilities, even in established systems, And of course, there is no such thing as a bottomless pit for a budget to counter cyber attacks. Don't you think more needs to be done in the space of collaboration, shared resources beyond what's being done today? And of course, there's always this need, we talk about building capabilities, building competencies and all that. Why isn't more being done in that space as well? I mean, this would be the toolbox to create the cybersecurity space of 2020 and beyond. These would be top priorities, don't you think? Thank you.
I think you're totally right, and education would be an excellent thing to do. The question is, what avenue do you take for that kind of education? The media have a lot to do with it. So probably educating people on the streets about the realities of cybersecurity, how it affects them, how it affects the public, and what to do and not to do. Now, and education can start very early, particularly, let's say, our kids who use the social media all the time. Okay? So make sure that they are aware of the vulnerabilities that they create through the social media. But you are absolutely right that education is critical, and frankly, I have not looked very much at the effectiveness of doing that. So I have to agree with you that it would probably be very effective, but I cannot tell you what would be the cost effectiveness because I've not looked at it.
Would there be any other questions? I think these are very interesting ideas. Obviously, this is an evolving field. And it's not just about all these, in my opinion, it's not just about all these attacks that cause perhaps situations that can be very costly to the company. But to me, there are some of these so-called low-cost events that is actually occurring because people are releasing their data all the time. To get hold of an app, people love the convenience of an app, and they just release all kind of data about themselves. I thought that is horrendous, actually. I'm not sure what you think.
You're totally right, and in fact, one of my first slides shows exactly that, and that's why I'm trying to reach. Okay, here it is. And as you can see, although I've messed up the viewing, but as you can see, in these 60,000 data points, most of them were small attacks. Small attacks, except that if you add up the cost of all that, it's pretty bad. You have a few that have cost quite a lot of hours of investigation, etc. But if you sum up all the little ones, yes. And so that's why we're talking about double encryption and the kinds of, what have we found? That double encryption was really full disk encryption and two-factor authentication were the two things that really helped for the little events that add up to a lot of cost. So without having, again, the 16 character codes, passwords.
Thank you very much. I think we have posed enough questions, and we enjoyed your lectures a lot. So maybe you could join me to thank Elisabeth. Thank you very much for coming. Is there something prepared now? You want to share the?
So we'd like to thank everyone for coming. We have actually prepared some light refreshments. So if you want to get some time with the speakers, we can actually just proceed outside to speak and have some refreshments. Thank you very much. Thank you.